Welcome to Crim City. I'm Josh Hanrahan.
I'm Mark Murray.
Moz, today we've got a guest who you've been wanting to have on for a very long time. One of Sydney's most respected solicitors and a man who's looked after many of the city's biggest names and the biggest cases.
Only person I could find older than me.
Oh, I'll take that as a guarded compliment.
Greg Goold, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, gentlemen.
Moz, I'm going to let you take it from here because you guys have obviously covered, or you've covered many of the cases that Greg's been involved in over the years. Is there one in particular that...
The one that stands out for me that I didn't really know Greg was involved in is Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, who she brought down the New South Wales Police Force, Roger Rogerson. It was her bravery. She went public after her boyfriend, Warren Lanfranchi, was shot in a laneway by Roger Rogerson at the time in the line of duty, which we now believe may not be the case.
May have just been a flat-out murder.
But Sallie-Anne, you not so much representative, but were looking after her interests around that time, weren't you?
Not so much her interests, Mark, but we had a connection insofar as my then partner Gary Cameron, who's now deceased, and I were running a practice at Bondi Junction, and Gary was looking after a young lady by the name of Ros Nelson, who was involved in the I think it was called the Prostitutes Collective at that stage.
I remember that. Yeah. And
Ros was the secretary or an office bearer, and the word I think got out to the police or those in the police force who were interested in Sally that we may have had her diary.
And she was very outspoken, gone public, knew a lot of cops, didn't she? She was an informant.
Look, I don't know whether she was an informant or not, but all I know is that she was very much involved in that sort of murky environment that existed back in the 80s post the Woodward Royal Commission and before the Wood Royal Commission, when police were very much involved in the day-to-day activities of the criminal underworld, more so than they are now.
So for people of my generation, this, to just put it in a few small sentences, as I understand it, you guys can clearly tell me if I'm wrong. So this is all about Roger Rogerson, and Sallie-Anne Huckstepp's boyfriend was killed by Rogerson, and she came out and said publicly that he had done it.
But it was
and that made her a target.
And you were saying, when word got out, there was a whisper that you had her diaries. What happened at the office? You were telling me. I'd never heard this till now.
There was a break-in into our office. The interesting thing was that the thieves came in through the corrugated iron roof. Our office was situated up next to the Waverley bus depot. The roof was somewhat expertly cut, and they got into the office. They rifled through filing cabinets, which is not where you'd want to look for stuff except if you're interested in files and so forth. And it was in the days when we still had clients paying in cheques.
Yes.
So it was cheques.
You know what a cheque is?
Yeah, I know what a cheque
is. And, there was quite a few cheques where we left them ready for banking the next day, laying there, not touched.
Really, yeah.
And the only thing that was touched were filing cabinets, and the filing cabinet that was where Roz's material would have been placed was well and truly rifled.
Right.
And that gave rise to our suspicions that the only thing that someone would be interested in was that diary.
Did they get the diary?
Well, as it turned out, we didn't have the diary.
Oh.
But
there were a lot of worried people with that diary.
There was talk about us having the diary, but that never surfaced. I subsequently met Sally on a few occasions, and she was quite a nice girl, but really, really petrified.
Yeah, quite right. As we know, she was in then 1986 found in the Duck Pond at Centennial Park. And first of all, they tried to write it off as just, she's a junkie. She was a heroin user. But and then later they thought she'd actually been strangled. No one has ever been convicted. I think Neddy's number one, and but back then, Neddy's a bit like Roger. You can blame him for everything now from the 80s because
he was one of my clients for a short period of time. I'd been asked by Val Bellamy, who was Neddy's long-time lawyer, to look after him. For some reason, Val wasn't able to act, and I'd heard stories about Neddy, and then met him, and I can say honestly that he's the only criminal identity who I've ever felt uncomfortable in his presence.
Why is that?
I just regarded him as Resident Evil.
Really?
Oh yeah, he was
a huge man too.
A big man, really, really frightening in the way he dealt with people and the way he came across. Like he had this sort of really sort of innate, overbearing sort of presence.
He's one of those. I only saw him once up at the White Horse in Surrey Hills hotel, and I was from a distance. He's massive, and he had this aura of violence around him, didn't he? He just oozed violence.
In saying that, I never had any problems with him, but you had that feeling about the man that he had this sort of presence.
Well, you had a fair bit to do with some of those characters up in the Cross.
Well, once I left Waverley, went to Bondi Junction, I got to act for a King's Cross identity by the name of Louis Bayer, who, when I started acting for him, his young driver was John Ibrahim. So I got introduced to John and Sam. At that stage, the younger brothers, Michael and Fadi, weren't running around. I think they were still in short pants at that stage. And John was just a driver. He wasn't involved in anything untoward at all. And Louis was running around, I think, doing his best, providing under-the-radar security, if you might call it.
And his brother Billy ended up doing
15 years.
Yeah, at least.
Well, what happened was Billy got involved in drugs. Louis never did. But a funny story involving John and Louis later was Louis was eventually arrested for possession of heroin. And I won't name the names of the people involved, but it was suggested that a detective had loaded him up with a small package of heroin outside the Tunnel nightclub, which John had purchased and was running. This was before DCMs. Now, John was a witness in the case, and he never lets me forget this. But John didn't want to come and give evidence of what he'd seen in relation to the case, because it might have affected the way his licence was being considered in relation to the tunnel.
Because they're pretty powerful, the cops up at the Cross, weren't they? They ruled it. Yeah.
They were. So I had to get him to court. And I'd rung him up and I'd issued him with a subpoena, and he said, "Greg, I am not coming to court. No way. I'm not going to put my head on the chopping block." I said, "John, I've got no choice. Louis told me you've got to be at court to give evidence in his favour." So he wouldn't come to court, so I got a summons issued for him to be at court the next day. The police picked him up, I think it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning at the Cross at the tunnel. They took him to central cells, locked him up in central cells and brought him up at 10 o'clock, and he was looking at me like death warmed up. And he eventually gave evidence, but as I say, never lets me forget it.
You have a pretty long-standing relationship with John, because it's only more recently that you acted for his girlfriend Sarah Budge.
Yes, I did.
And she was charged with possession of a firearm, wasn't it? What do you call it? A baby Glock?
It was a baby Glock, yeah. Right. It was the story on the Glock was that it had been stolen from a gun show some 20 years earlier. So it was not an antique, but it had been around for a while and I don't think it had been used.
It was a pretty brutal case.
It was a massive story.
I mean, here you have the
glamorous, Sarah's a very glamorous girl.
Well, she was a model.
Been a
She
model,
is a model.
and she worked in the Cross at some of the bars, managing them, and I think some of the ones maybe John owned, and then they.
And John, by this stage, was quite high profile. He'd been running 50, 60 clubs, hadn't he? And his brothers had got in trouble.
Yep.
Particularly Sam and Michael.
And so police then start to, and you can step in at any point, correct me where I'm wrong on retelling this, but they essentially crack down on the Ibrahims. There's the big raid at John's place, and they go to Sarah's unit, which was somewhere else in the
Double
eastern
Bay?
suburbs.
It was in Double Bay. It was at the
And they
back street of
found
Double
that's
Bay.
where they found this baby Glock in a cupboard or something like that. Is that right?
Exactly right, Josh. Yeah. What had happened
How
was
fucking good am I?
What did you go and read up on that before you came?
What had happened was they were putting pressure on the Ibrahims at that stage, particularly Michael and to a lesser extent Sam, who is a whole story in his own right. So John was being subject to pressure and searches and all this sort of stuff, and people connected with John were being subject to those searches. And as a result of that, Sarah's flat at Double Bay was searched as well, and the Glock, as you've said, Josh, was discovered in one of the cupboards. So I hadn't done any work, obviously, for John, and I'd not done a lot of work for the brothers, although I had looked after Michael in relation to an attempt murder case, which we won some time earlier. And so John then came to see me, and he basically said, Greg, I don't care what it costs, I don't care what you need to do in terms of getting the best team available. Sarah is to win this case and not to go to jail. The interesting thing about the case, which was certainly in our favour, was that the prosecution chose to run the case on the basis of sole possession rather than joint possession.
Yes. So what's the difference there? Talk us through that just quickly.
Yeah. The difference is Sarah solely possessed the gun herself. She didn't possess it with someone else, so that someone else put it there with her knowledge, and therefore she was exercising possession in concert with somebody else.
Yeah. So that's a big winner for you.
Big winner for us.
Yeah.
And I was, greatly assisted by the fact that I had one of Sydney's leading senior counsel, Simon Buchan, leading the case. I had another sort of up-and-coming junior barrister, Michael Burke, will probably get silk in due course, as his junior. And we ran, I thought, a very, very good case for Sarah, but ultimately Sarah got in the witness box. And I've had some good witnesses in my day, but she was excellent in telling the truth and saying, it's not my gun, and I'm not sure who put it there, but it could have been a number of people.
Yeah.
And that's really all you needed at that point. Is that's all you needed the jury to believe because of the sole possession case? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly, Josh. And because law works on the basis of you're innocent until proven guilty. And whilst you guys run your stories and all that sort of stuff, ultimately, proof beyond reasonable doubt's a really, really high standard. We've seen
quite rightly
the Lerman case where, basically on the balance of probabilities you could be guilty of anything.
Yeah.
But when you've got to go that step further and say, is there any other explanation consistent with innocence that could be available, then you don't have proof beyond reasonable doubt. And one thing that's really important for people to understand is that criminal law, as it's developed over centuries, is based upon the proposition that we can sacrifice 99 guilty men for the sake of one innocent man not being improperly convicted.
Have you had a lot of innocent men?
I've had a few. Sarah included.
Sarah,
I was just going to say, I'll ask on Sarah. You get the not guilty verdict. How did you celebrate? I don't know the answer.
Question.
I don't know the answer, but I reckon it would have been pretty good fun.
Interestingly enough, it was an interesting trial because the presiding judge was Judge David Arnott of the Arnott's Biscuit family. Well, we didn't get the lollies, but we got the biscuits. Is that what you're going to say?
You've been dying to say that, haven't you?
And but he, as we were leaving the court, Judge Arnott interestingly said to Sarah Budge, you should be very grateful for having an excellent legal team acting on your behalf.
And then did you go and have something more than biscuits?
I don't know that we did. I think Sarah was so relieved to be over the ordeal of the criminal trial, which is really, really taxing.
It would
particularly this one, because they really went after John and Sarah publicly with text messages.
Yeah.
They took their private life and made it public, and that was part of the case.
And Sarah is a beautiful person, really, really decent woman, and comes from a hard-working family. She was supported by Mum, who subsequently died of cancer, and her brother. They all gave amazing support. John didn't come to the case much, but was on the phone to me every day to see how the trial was going.
If we can move, that's semi-recent, but if we can move to the last couple of years, and there's a few big people in Sydney's underworld who have put you front and centre in terms of court cases and whatnot. The first one is Alen Moradian, who was your client, who was killed at Bondi Junction. It's something we've spoken about extensively on this podcast and in The War Too, the documentary. Tell us about Alen, how long you'd looked after him, and what... I'm always fascinated to ask what people are like, that we've never met but have covered extensively. So what was he like?
Well, Alen was a really interesting character. I first came in contact with him when I was asked to see him at Salwater Jail, when he was there in custody for major drug importing, which was being conducted through a freight forwarder or import agent who was involved and later, I think, gave evidence. I didn't actually do the drug case. He pleaded guilty to the importation, which was very, very sophisticated in terms of drugs, cocaine coming into a private bond store.
And it was found as well. But
No, not what the guns weren't found. What happened with the guns is that where I came into it. So I go out to see Alen, and he said, Greg, I've got your name, I want to use you. I said, well, what's the case about? He said, I don't want to use you on the case. He said, I've got Abigail Bannister, a really good professional lawyer and mate of mine in the law, and she's doing the case. I want you to do something else. I said, what's that? And he said, well, I'm pleading guilty. I want to get a discount. I want you to hand in my guns.
This is a very common thing that I don't know a lot of people know, and it's guns for reduced sentences.
Well, because Alen was sort of a principal in the importing scheme, and so a high-level criminal, it made sense for him to say, well, I've got access to this weaponry. And as it turned out, I ended up handing in 17 guns. 17 guns. Everything from a starting pistol, AK-47s, rifles, other pistols.
Yeah. Just in the back of the car?
I'll tell you the funny story about this. Right through to a World War II pristine Bren gun.
Wow.
Oh, I'm not a particularly gun person. I don't like guns. I don't know what they do. And but I saw this Bren gun. It was a really, really beautiful piece of machinery. So I ring them up on one day and say, listen, I've got another gun. I think it was Arthur.
Not Katsajanis.
Katsajanis. Yeah. And he was in charge of the group that I was involved in, and he put me in touch with a senior constable sergeant who I'd ring up. I said, I've got another one. This is a bit different. I said, it's an AR-15 assault rifle with a grenade launcher. I said,
out of Scarface.
And I said, by the way,
you've seen that one.
I said, by the way, I've got the grenade as well.
Oh.
And so I get delivered the AR-15, and so I ring up the officer who's going to collect, and I say, look, I've got the gun and I've got the deal comes with a grenade as well. And they said, oh, we can't take that. And I said, why? I said, they said, oh, no, we've got to get someone from Army Ordnance down.
Wow.
We've got to get a major. So they get a major to meet me at Surrey Hills, and I drive up. It's in the boot of my car, bouncing around. And they've got this major there because it's so dangerous and it could go up at any stage. And I'm thinking, well, that's
not what you were thinking.
And so, yeah, that was a funny one.
We might take it a bit of a rapid quick fire round. But just when Alen died, how did you find out?
We found out because I think we got a call from either his wife, Natasha, or it was on the news.
Yeah.
But Alen was a very, very personable bloke. in terms of dealing with us. Always straight up, never asked any questions about what we wanted and why we wanted it, just was always happy to go along with what we wanted. And I ran into him just by chance after he got out of jail, and he was totally different. He'd shaved his head, had a mouth of gold teeth, and he was sitting at a restaurant in Elizabeth Street with the same person who gave me the guns.
Well, right.
And I got called over, and I didn't recognise him because he'd lost weight, changed his complexion, and then as time went by, we found out about his concerns about his safety.
Yes.
And he would only ever come and meet us on his terms, and at times when he would pop in, no arrangements. He was living in 4 different houses.
Wow.
And
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Go on.
I was just, I know we're running out. We could keep going for days. We haven't even touched on you. You were talking about one of your other clients was Wally Ahmed, who you described as a really lovely guy.
I dealt with Wally in the early days, and I acted for him when there was a shooting over at Condell Park involving a guy called Long-Haired Danny. And I always found Wally to be a really personable guy. He was respectful. He had a good sense of humour, and was a nice guy. Interestingly enough, I also acted for Hamad Assad in relation to some drug possession cases. He was known as H in those days,
right. Yeah.
before he was known as the executioner, and he was a little bit more. I suppose you'd call him a bit more uptight and not as relaxed as Wally. No, but Wally was. I always found Wally to be a decent person.
Do you love your job?
I really enjoy my job. The interesting thing about being a criminal lawyer, and this is what I say to people, is if you're a tradesman, you get let into people's houses. If you're a criminal lawyer, you get let into their lives.
Yeah. Wow. You ever been scared?
Apart from being in the presence of Neddy, not really.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Look, we could go for
days.
Yeah. That's like between him and me, the memory of the cases. Like you can paint Sydney from the 70s.
From the late 70s, yeah.
From the late 70s, which is...
You have been talking about having Greg on for a long time, and I understand why. It's a really good point, Moz. Like, journos, lawyers, footballers, whatever you do for a career, normally people have a peak, and that's it. I mean, you've been going strong for 5 decades now?
4? Well, I'm into my 5th.
Yes, but it's incredible, and it's no wonder that you've got all these stories to tell. So thank you for coming to share with us.
We'll go to Diathenes and maybe with some people that we both know and have a really nice.
Well, Diathenes is a story in itself.
I reckon they went there because it's underground and they believed they couldn't get listening devices or it wouldn't work. Anyway, that was why it was a favourite, wasn't it?
Well, it's still a favourite.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stories that'll never emerge from the Diathenes dungeon.
Okay.
Oh, we'll go down there.
But the food's still great.
Good.
Yeah,
right.
It is. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Crim City. I'm Josh Hanrahan.
I'm Mark Murray.
Greg, really appreciate your time today and your stories. They were fascinating.
Yeah. My pleasure, boys. If you need a few more, you can always call me back.
We might have to get you back. We'll see how we go. Our executive producer is Dan Box. Our editor is Martin Peralta. You can catch us every day at dailytelegraph.com.au and in the paper, weekly on TikTok.
Yep.
And if you've got this podcast somewhere, well, you can get it again next week, wherever you got it.
Thank you.